this isn't an exercise prescription paper. Nonetheless, you should come out with an understanding that just as we need different methods of assessment for different types of physical fitness, we also need different ways of developing or training those different types of fitness. Now, if someone is very deconditioned from a long period of sedentariness, months or especially years, then really any physical movement will likely increase most parameters of fitness somewhat for some time. And this is going to be even more true if we're dealing with someone where there is substantial deconditioning on top of prolonged illness, maybe chronic illness. If someone can barely walk up a flight of stairs, doing so is likely to increase their leg strength, their balance, and their cardiorespiratory fitness. For everyone else though, exercise prescription is going to have to be a little bit more nuanced and take their specific goals into consideration. I'll summarize with what I think is or should guide physical activity recommendations for, well, overall health and function. That's what really we're going to be looking at in this module. Also, because there are no privacy or copyright considerations, if I use myself as the example, that's exactly what I'm going to do, and that's why I'm going to choose myself. We'll start with cardiorespiratory fitness, which we might also call endurance or stamina. A good way of tackling that particular topic is to talk about training zones. If you were to look up training zones, you would find a fairly similar set of slightly different systems, but some with more divisions than others. Most will stop at what they call zone 5 with maximum aerobic performance. But we can build aerobic fitness with supramaximal efforts, basically with sprints. So I've gone with a 6th zone to include that. The most seemingly objective way of assessing what zone you or someone is in is to use percent heart rate maximum. And that's what it sounds like. We each have a maximum heart rate that goes down by roughly 1 beat per minute per year. We can look at the percentage. Unfortunately, that requires actually getting tests to determine your personal or someone else's personal maximum, as the formulas that are available can, for some people, be quite far off. There are also some other variables to consider, so we have a slightly more nuanced measure known as the heart rate reserve. Again, this would require determining your maximum heart rate with a maximal exercise test. Luckily, a surprisingly good alternative is rate of perceived exertion, or RPE, discussed in an earlier module. It's hard to say what activities are most consistent with each zone, as intensity is always relative to the individual. Nonetheless, we can say something about the characteristics of each zone in relation to breathlessness. Zone 1 would allow a conversation without strain. In zone 2, you could have a conversation, but it would be challenging. By zone 3, talking is challenging and likely to interfere with the activity, and zone 4 makes a flowing conversation of any kind unfeasible. And zone 5 probably restricts communication to a word or two at a time. Even with zone 2, actually having a conversation would be uncomfortable. You would use shorter sentences and try and make the other person do most of the talking. That way you have some idea of what zone you're in. And of course, you can use RPE. Now, for the sake of good breathing mechanics, I would generally avoid having to talk much if you're working beyond zone 1, really. So I'm not suggesting you do zone 2 while talking, but it should be an option. Zone 1 through 3 allow longer sessions of continuous sustained effort for many minutes, up to possibly a few hours. Zone 4 can still be continuous for many minutes, but as you've already learned, the higher the intensity, the shorter the duration has to be. So it wouldn't be nearly as long as zone 2 or 3. Zones 5 and 6 still involve short to very short duration bouts, but these can be repeated a few times with recovery intervals of complete rest, or let's say zone 1 between those bouts or those intervals. Another thing to consider is that the higher the intensity, the greater the time to recovery. So if you want to do multiple maximal zone 5 or 6 efforts, then you would need to have sufficiently long recovery in between. And that brings me to this pyramid here. There are no specific targets, as these will depend on how much time a person has to dedicate to physical activity. The pyramid both describes the time and frequency allocation as well as the progression as a proportion of time. The foundation is simply minimizing sedentary time, that is outside of sleep. Sleep is the, if you like, good sedentary time, and it's not to say that all sedentary time outside of sleep is bad, but generally it should be sedentary time done with a purpose. Sleep, meditation of some sort, rest and recovery in between bouts of activity, for example. So foundationally, minimizing sedentary time. This could mean things like accumulating 8,000 steps, or ideally more per day, if that's feasible for someone. Now, this is achievable for the greatest proportion of the population, as this level of activity can be paired with many other activities such as housework, gardening, carrying groceries, walking as a means of transportation, walking while having a conversation, either directly with someone that you're walking with, or it could be cycling, for example, or on the phone. Not all physical activity time or exercise time needs to be just about the physical activity or exercise. Sometimes you can, certainly at zone 1, to a lesser extent zone 2, fit other things in. And if you're just consuming, listening to an audiobook, a podcast, or mostly having the other person have a conversation, then that could even be achievable at some of the higher zones. So after reducing sedentary time comes zone 2. Both zones 1 and 2 can help with recovery, and they improve sleep drive, for example, meaning they will help you to sleep better that night. So this is the next on the list if someone is transitioning from being very sedentary to doing just some exercise or some physical activity. It should also make up the bulk of cardiorespiratory exercise, no matter where someone's at. Once we get into zones 3 and 4, we need to consider that this puts more stress on the body and therefore requires some sort of intentional recovery, or at least recovery time. This is also going to be uncomfortable for many previously sedentary people, so it should come a little later and make up less of each week's exercise than, let's say, zone 2 or simply reducing sedentary time. Now, zones 5 and 6 put even more stress on the body, so these should be used more sparingly. Maybe once a week for zone 6, if the person does zone 6 at all, and 1 to 2 times per week for, say, zone 5. Now, there's likely some wiggle room where zone 6 isn't necessary, or zone 6 sessions can replace a zone 5. There does appear to be some benefit to bringing heart rate to maximum once or twice a week, though. So this higher intensity training should be added last, but should be done if possible. Now, I've done research using high intensity intermittent training, so in the zone 5 area, in patients with fatty liver and in patients with type 2 diabetes who were previously sedentary. So it's absolutely possible, provided someone has had an exercise screen and they're regarded as relatively low risk, there aren't any obvious heart problems. Okay, we did carefully screen people before we put them on this kind of program. But it demonstrates that it absolutely is possible, even for previously sedentary people, even for people with certain chronic conditions. Now, it probably isn't ideal if the desire is to shift someone towards being a lifelong active person. Then we'd want to scaffold up in the intensity over time as they become more comfortable. In terms of progression, right, this is how we move ourselves to ever greater efforts, you could say. This is really built in. As your cardiovascular fitness, or anyone's cardiovascular fitness, improves, you or they will be able to do more at a given heart rate. If you're in zone 2, for example, you'll simply go faster or against a greater resistance over time, because you'll notice that, hey, it's getting easier. I'm at that RPE, that rate of perceived exertion that I was targeting before, but I'm able to do more. I'm going faster, or I'm able to do it on a slight incline, or whatever it might be. And the same is absolutely true for other zones. As we get fitter, the same effort, if you like, the same will come at a greater work output, greater calorie burn, or greater wattage, however you want to assess that. Now, in relation to zone 1, here are just some examples of moving toward and into zone 1. I mean, some of these you might say, okay, it's more like zone 0.5, but it's getting away from sedentariness. You know, starting with something like a standing desk. Again, if it's feasible for someone, and ideally not all day is spent standing. All day could be spent at a slow walk if someone's capable of that, because that helps the blood to circulate. But prolonged periods of standing without moving, you do get a little bit of blood pooling. And if you think back to human anatomy and physiology, then you should hopefully remember what that's about. The muscular pump isn't active. As soon as we start getting movement in there, though, it is quite feasible for many people, not everyone, to be on their feet for extended periods of time, and that can be a good thing. But ideally, if it's just standing, one, it's only just shy of sedentary, and maybe sometimes should be spent standing, sometimes should be spent sitting. Ideally, we would be doing something very slow, because we don't want to distract from, say, the work that's going on. There is an example here of someone pedaling. They are seated, but just to kind of have it not be true sedentary time. So how might you look at this, or how might this look in a reasonably active person? Personally, because again, for copyright reasons, I have no problem, or privacy reasons, I have no problem disclosing this. I aim to get about 30 minutes, give or take, at zone 2 most days. So I might do half an hour on a stationary bike in the morning, or do part of or all of the meetings, especially if I can log in online, call in online, while on that stationary bike, or while walking. Some mornings I might do a kettlebell circuit to work kind of in the zone 2, and also work on some mobility at the same time, so hit multiple areas of fitness at once. On cold days, there's an upshot of this. I tend to stay warm over the next several hours. Sometimes I'll do some conditioning workouts with sort of a zone 3 or 4 focus. And again, these don't have to be runs or bike rides. They might be loaded carries. So I think I've got an example here. Again, that's going to tax my cardiorespiratory system, but there's also elements of strength in there. And I just don't find them as boring. Right? Someone else will choose a different activity. Then once a week, I'll hop on the assault bike. You can see that it's here. Cameras reverse things. Where there are 8 rounds of 10 seconds on and 20 seconds rest, and that's basically my zone 6. Right? That's as high and as hard as I'll go, and that absolutely does have me feeling like my heart is going to, jump out of my chest. So would I advise a patient with a chronic disease to do that? Absolutely not. Not until they've reversed that condition or have it under extremely good control, and that's what they feel like doing. But for someone who's reasonably healthy, it's doable, and it's good to get that heart rate up. Me personally, I've just always been more interested in resistance training, which I do for enjoyment as much as any effect, whereas much of the cardio work I just do for health. So those 3 to 4 resistance training sessions also put me in zone 2 much of the time. Right? And it would certainly be possible to program them in a way that would keep heart rate elevated better, but you'd be in and out of zone 2, 3, maybe even 4 in terms of heart rate. So they're not a full replacement for zone 2, but lots of things can be done to do a lot in less time. Moving on, building strength will require some form of resistance training. Now that can be dumbbells, that can be barbells, it could be kettlebells, sandbags, or other implements, and it can also be body weight, so what some people call calisthenics, and of course it can be a combination of any or all of those. The key thing is that whatever someone chooses, it should be possible to quantify to make tracking progress easy, right? You should be able to track the load in some way. So the weight of something, or at least the repetitions. There are other things you can track, such as what rest periods you're using. You don't need to make it complex. The idea is, though, that over time, you progress. It's a little bit more obviously built in with the cardiorespiratory work, with cardiovascular work. Here you actually need to make a considered effort to use a heavier weight or use it for more repetitions, especially if it's body weight, do more repetitions or make it harder. So if we look at a push-up, for example, press up, then elevating the feet somewhat. One is going to change the angles a bit, but also you'll be shifting more of your body weight through each repetition, for example. So that's really what's meant by progressive overload. You need to be progressing. You're not going to get stronger at least once you're several months into training, and certainly several years into training, without deliberately increasing load in some way. Not necessarily the weight there. As I said, it could be repetitions, it could be doing more in less time, but something has to increase for you to keep improving. Right, with resistance training, we tend to talk about exercises in terms of what we're doing. We tend to talk about sets, so how many bounce, intervals, lots of an exercise we do, and we talk about repetitions. The exercise might be the barbell deadlift, or a goblet squat, or it could be pull-ups. The image is there to make a point that with appropriate modification, these are accessible movements to much of the population, even some chronically ill, even some elderly, and for that matter, even up to a point, the very young. Of course, proper coaching is important here, and it makes a big difference to safety. Each exercise is done for a number of repetitions. Pull-ups, for example, it could be 8 pull-ups or 12 pull-ups. And then we would do those 8, 10 or 12 pull-ups a number of times with rest in between. Right, so that is our set. We do our 8, that's our set done. Maybe we program 2 sets, 3 sets, so we'll try and do another 8, There are many ways of complicating this, but generally for most people it doesn't need to be complicated. Exercise appropriate selection, appropriate number of sets, not that much, we'll get onto that in another slide, and repetitions. And there are a very broad range of repetitions in which we might see benefit. For strength, that's sort of in the 3 to 5 range to build muscle and get other benefits of exercise, including some strength development. You're really dealing with 4 repetitions up to 30, maybe even more for some exercises. So a good well-rounded exercise or resistance training program will include some kind of vertical push, a vertical pull. You can see examples of that here. Pardon the noise. Horizontal push, a horizontal pull of some sort, hinge movement, so that's hinging at the hip, and also some kind of squatting type motion. Right. If someone has mobility issues to address or injuries to rehabilitate or obvious left-right imbalances in strength, then that should also be factored in. But again, that's really then for an exercise professional. Now these movements don't need to be completely independent of each other. Here you can see me tick most of the boxes in one kettlebell complex. There's a hip hinge. There was a vertical push just there. Squatting motion. There's a horizontal pull. And there's a horizontal push. Also, it's quite feasible for me to keep going through this for potentially a few minutes. And as I do that, I'll be going through the zones 2, 3, maybe 4. And the stronger someone is, the more they could use this kind of training to actually tick off zone 5, quite potentially as well, and certainly zone 4. right? So we absolutely can combine different stimuli for time efficiency, for example. Please note, just as a disclaimer, this is not exercise instruction or prescription. In practical terms, for the vast majority of people, one exercise per movement pattern, so vertical push, for example, horizontal pull, is going to be sufficient. And for a beginner, one working set of the chosen exercise is sufficient for the first probably 6 to 12 weeks of a program. Right? That's for a complete beginner, or someone who has been sedentary and is therefore deconditioned for some time, irrespective of their background. A working set, what we're describing here, is what follows a thorough warm-up. And that's a general warm-up, and also it could be mobility focused. Again, certain other qualities like balance, mobility could be factored into the warm-up so that those are ticked off. Unless someone has a specific need to do more, that could well be sufficient. And then we do a few warm-up sets of a specific exercise, so steadily moving up in weight. So those body parts and those body parts are warmed up, and those movements are, if you like, grooved. They're practiced. I'll go into volume next, but for now, let's define a working set, because this comes after the warm-up. A working set should involve going near momentary muscular failure. In practice, this means that a person cannot do one more repetition of the exercise in a controlled manner. Right, that's how we're going to define that. Now, it can take a novice some time before they actually push themselves that hard, because they're probably going to find it quite uncomfortable. Now, it's never comfortable to push hard, but people get used to it and they fear it less with time, and some people learn to like that discomfort. I mean, some people already built that way to begin with, and other people sort of develop that over time. But certainly they become more tolerant, and it's less scary. For safety, we want to emphasize control of the resistance, be that an external resistance or body weight. So it's not absolute muscular failure. It's not I can't move an inch anymore. For safety reasons, in that definition is a degree of control, right? We start to lose control. What might this look like? Well, a novice, especially one with health problems, will get good benefits from one working set per exercise. Thorough warm-up and then a working set. And maybe doing 2 to 3 sessions per week. Well, that's not really that much, especially one working set per exercise. And once someone's thoroughly warmed up, maybe they've already done 1 or 2 of their exercises, by the time they get to the third one, they'll only need 1 to 2 warm-up sets. Again, that needs to be tailored to the individual. Right, in 2 to 3 sessions per week, you can get a lot done, including warm-up, in a half an hour, 40-minute session. You could even use some zone 2 cardio, for example, as the warm-up, as long as it's long enough, and then go into the session. So that we can be time efficient here. By week 12, and maybe a little bit before in a relatively healthy person, adding an extra set per exercise and maybe cutting down from 3 whole body sessions to 2 would be a way to go. Or time permitting, doing an upper body session and a lower body session twice each per week. Again, it comes down to time, personal preference, goals, and so on. So there are numerous ways you can slice this. But this group certainly doesn't need an arm day and a chest day. It doesn't need to be that focused for health. And you could even argue it doesn't even necessarily need to be that way for maximum muscle building or maximum strength building. Moving on to the intermediate trainee, they can handle some more volume. But increases should be gradual. If you're going from 1 set to 2, you've just increased volume 100%. That is a massive increase. That's a much bigger increase than, say, going from 10 repetitions at a given weight to 12 repetitions. Right? So we need to take that into consideration. And again, increase gradually. Not every exercise needs to have, in week 12, an extra set added. We don't want to suddenly double the volume for anyone. For health and to build a good level of strength and muscle mass, 3 sets per exercise is actually quite well supported by the current research. The goal, after all, is really to do more weight over time, not simply more and more volume over time. Right? Resistance training isn't like marathon training. And even there, it's not really right to say more is better. It's always enough to stimulate the result that you want, to achieve the goal that you want, and really as little as possible to achieve that, so that you're not stressing the body unnecessarily and taking a long time to recover. Now, we'll note that muscles can dramatically increase in strength and size over time, but the supporting systems like the nervous system, the digestive system, the liver, they don't experience the same degree of change. Not that they don't experience any change. Generally, they'll get some beneficial change, and certainly neurologically, nervous system wise, we get more efficient. Strength is as much a skill as anything, but they don't dramatically change, whereas a muscle might conceivably over a long enough time get twice the size it was before. We're not going to get a liver that's twice the size, lungs that's twice the size, the heart isn't going to grow twice the size, and we're not going to grow a bunch of new nerves either. Right? So we need to factor that in. So as we get, actually, ironically, once we move kind of to the experience stage, now we're getting very, very experienced and very, very well developed, probably we need less in terms of total volume, fewer sets, maybe fewer reps, because we can handle so much more weight. So it's not a case of simply adding more and more volume. What you see there on the slide is a pretty good all-round ballpark figure for, if it's a professional athlete, of course, or even a very serious amateur, you're going to want a coach. Right? You're going to want a strength and conditioning coach, maybe a sports-specific coach, or coaches as well. That's not what this is about. This is just in terms of health and general performance. So how should people progress? First and foremost, they should add weight and or repetitions while sticking to the same set of exercises. Recall, strength is partly a skill. There's a degree of specificity to the movement. Now at the beginning, increases in strength come very quickly, so it should be possible to increase most and maybe even every session. Right, at a repetition or two, or at a very small amount of weight, like equivalent of about 5% maybe. There are numerous ways someone might progress, but the simplest one I like to use is to have a target repetition range. Let's say that's 3 to 5 repetitions, which is a good range for strength development, and you will build some muscle in this range as well. The weight should stay the same until all working sets can be completed with the upper end of the repetition range. When that happens, the weight should be increased the next workout, unless there's some compelling reason like a long layoff or injury or whatever for that not to be the case. So let's use the example of a program with 3 working sets per exercise and a chosen repetition range of 3 to 5. If that person gets 5, 5, and 4, they do not increase the weight at the next workout. Indeed, if they were to get only 3 repetitions in the first set, dropping the weight should be what's done the next workout, right? Clearly, for whatever reason, that's too heavy. But if they get 5, 5, and 5 repetitions this workout, when they come around to do that workout again, they should increase weight. That's a nice ballpark figure that actually stays true to the individual's physiology, what they're capable of. And the weight increase should be in the 5 to 10% range. As someone gets stronger and stronger and stronger, probably that could be too much. Right? Certainly 10% is too much. If someone can already pull, let's say, 200 kilograms off the ground in a deadlift, a 10% increase will be an extra 20 kilograms. That's rather a lot, but maybe they could increase by 2.5. So this is quite responsive to changes in ability. And it even allows for a drop in weight on occasion when it's called for because recovery is impaired in some way. That brings us to power development. This is the ability to generate force quickly, and it decreases dramatically with age, so it isn't something to neglect. Although it's probably not the first thing you think of in terms of training the aging individual. So let's just look at some examples. Power development isn't really something that can be done very well with heavy loads. Remember, heavy is relative here. Think in terms of percentage of 1 repetition maximum. There's an increased degree of injury risk for the deconditioned person and anyone lacking coordination. which is why I like throws, for example, or jumps onto something and then I step down rather than jumping out. I would have the other person step down rather than jumping down. Or it could just be broad jumps, as you saw there, because that has a lower risk than someone, say, jumping from a high level or trying to build power in a bench press, a ball you can just let go. And notice I don't catch the ball, nor use the highest platform to jump on. This is always constrained by safety concerns. Now, a sandy beach would be a great place to do this. You could throw a suitable sized rock there as well. That's not really going to bounce, and the sand will certainly absorb it. Here we want about 3 to 5 repetitions. So as soon as the next repetition is slower than the one that came before it, it's time to stop. Fatigue and power development don't go together. And 3 sets is generally plenty. The key message here is that different types of fitness are best developed using specific training approaches. Although, as we saw, certainly sometimes we can do a bit of mixing and matching, and maybe one method can be used to develop more than one area. Most people have limited time to be physically active, although nowhere near as much as they like to think once physical activity stops being viewed through the lens of going running or going to the gym, and they start exploring other options. What should most people do who have no specific sporting goal? We have national guidelines, and I'll draw on those somewhat, but also take into account what we're learning from the most recent research in this area, as well as my own personal practice and experience. So my recommendation starts with building strength and muscle, so some form of resistance training. If a person had only 2 or 3 hours of time to dedicate to exercise weekly, I would encourage them to do mostly resistance training and then really try and minimize their sedentary time, get those steps in, use an active form of transport to get to work. A well-designed resistance training program can address several qualities of fitness and drive many positive adaptations. With a well-designed warm-up, we can also address some different ones that maybe the resistance training itself won't address so well. Now, the obvious ones are absolute strength and strength endurance, perhaps power and speed for resistance training, but movements done through a full range of motion also promote flexibility. Unilateral and contralateral movements, so doing them with one side, can help develop balance and coordination. And lastly, by reducing rest periods between sets, heart rates can be kept elevated throughout that entire session so that we're moving in that zone 2, 3, and 4, for example. Now that might not be optimal for strength development or optimal for muscle hypertrophy size development, but it's certainly good for those just looking at general health improvements with a limited amount of time. Then if there is more time available, I would build in some interval training in zone 2 or even zone 6. These are extremely time efficient too. My zone 6 takes a 5-minute warm-up thereabouts, and then about 4 minutes of actual work. And even if it's more zone 5 and the intervals are longer, several minutes long, a lot can be achieved in 20 minutes to half an hour there. Again, keep in mind that I'd be looking at getting zone 1 or better yet zone 2 into a person's daily life for work, transport, socializing, leisure activities. Play. A game of frisbee might very well keep a person in zone 2. They can go hiking with friends. They can go bike riding with friends. It doesn't have to be about the exercise. That can be secondary. You just get it in there. Now, this is not going to be best for peak performance in a given sport or activity, but it's a solid model if general health, general longevity, so a longer life and a longer, healthier life are the goals, and time constraints exist, which they almost always do. We always need to consider the individual and what they want. So that's another key thing. That said, one thing I would like to emphasize is that the older the individual, the more important it is to have some emphasis on building strength and building or maintaining muscle and bone mass, so therefore avoiding frailty, because sarcopenia, so a loss of muscle mass and muscle quality, fatty infiltration of the muscle, for example, resulting in frailty, are a huge concern in those of advancing years, even though they may not realize it. And there is far too much emphasis on aerobic activity in that group. They are not likely to have huge problems because they are unfit in the classical sense. They are likely to have huge problems because they are too weak to do something, because they cannot stop themselves in a fall, and then they break, especially the hip, they break something, and then they can't be physically active for a really prolonged period. And it's very hard to recover from that. So resistance training, working on balance, working on kind of stopping strength, right, resisting movement are really crucial in that group. Just before we conclude, I'd really like to acknowledge the approach to physical activity promoted by people like Erwan Le Corre and others in the natural movement community, or the MoveNat community, that recognizes that building exceptional physical fitness across all types of physical fitness domains does not need to involve a gym with machines and very specially weighted implements. It doesn't necessarily require a bike or anything along those lines. And we need to acknowledge in these movements to, towards back to natural movement, what these days would be considered exceptional physical capacity was every day for our distant ancestors, and also for many modern day hunter-gatherers. So there is absolutely something to be said for getting out and being active in nature. And we actually have research to show that if you can be active in nature versus active, say, inside, there are additional benefits. And this will be far too long if I was to speculate on all the reasons why that may be, but it is fairly well established. Taking that idea of natural movement and moving in nature, in a way, one step further, but we could divide fitness up along a different set of lines, focusing more on our capacity for swimming, ambulation, so that's walking and running, crawling, jumping, not just how far, but how accurately, lifting and carrying, fighting, balancing, brachiating, so moving through trees, or in the example here, monkey bars, climbing, throwing, rather than dividing up into strength and power and endurance and so on. We could just as easily use these capacities as benchmarks. So another thing to consider. We don't need to be constrained by most of what passes for modern fitness. Just to recap, very deconditioned or detrained people will improve several types of fitness just by moving more. So that is our number one thing, whether we're getting back into things after injury or illness, or we're promoting this to others. We need to keep that in mind, that especially early on, anything is better than nothing. Another key message though is that, and this is more of a reminder, for intermediate to advanced exercises with specific goals, the principle of specific adaptations to imposed demands applies more. So that principle is also known as SAID. Basically, it means you get better at what you practice. However, as long as we're not trying to optimize any area of fitness, several can be addressed in the same session.